I extend a very warm welcome to our annual conference, which is titled Diasporic Japanese Writers, Straddling Haiku and Zen, under the auspices of our annual ALIM conference, which stands for Asian Literatures in Motion. So I very warmly welcome our keynote speaker, Professor of English Sheng Mei Ma from Michigan State University. I welcome in absentia Associate Professor Chitra Nair from the Government Sanskrit College of University of Kerala. I welcome our other speaker, Snigdha Mishra from the University of Hyderabad. She's an MPhil scholar in English literature, a research scholar, and I welcome Vivian Taylor, who's a recent MA graduate in cultural studies from Claremont Graduate University in California. Tomorrow, we'll have Dr. Roma Bhattacharya, a PhD from Oxford, who will chair. Dr. Julie Mehta will deliver her keynote, which is the second day. Associate Professor Shoshana Gans from Memorial University, Grenfell campus in Canada, will deliver her plenary lecture tomorrow. And Zifan Yang, an MA student from Stanford University, will give her paper, as will Ananya Bhaumik, who holds an MPhil from Jadavpur University in Calcutta. So welcome to this conference, which is the second. Rising Asia Foundation and Rising Asia Journal are fairly new in the business. The journal has published 6 issues, and we are on time to release the 7th in the month of January 2023. We've done, on the literature side, we've done our first annual Asian Literatures in Motion conference last year on the works of the Booker Prize winning author Michael Ondaatje, which went off very well. And I'm happy to announce that that book was within about 9 to 10 months of the conference having ended. We got a contract from an important scholarly publisher in London, who is now expected to publish the book, which is entering that process. And I very much hope that our current conference on Japan will head down the same way, because the other part of the good news is that under the current contract with this important academic publisher, that publisher has extended to us very kindly the rights for first refusal on any new book project that we might bring them. So we will certainly approach them with this one. So with that, I welcome our esteemed keynote lecturer, as well as our plenary lecturers and our other speakers. And I will now leave Professor Julie Mehta to take over the task of taking the conversation forward, to serve as the chair for the remaining part of the day. Julie will introduce Professor Sheng Mei Ma, but I will in turn introduce Julie. So Julie Banerjee Mehta holds an MA and a PhD degrees in English Literature and South Asian Studies from the University of Toronto. A specialist in diasporic post-colonial studies, she conceptualized and taught the Chancellor Emerita Vivian Poi Endowed Course on Asian Literatures on Asian Literatures and Cultures in Asia at the Department of English, University of Toronto, and the School for Canadian Studies. Her translation of Rabindranath Tagore's play The Post Office, Dagghar Post Office, was performed by Pleiades Theatre in Toronto in 2010 to critical acclaim. It had several runs, and for which she was named as one of 16 important South Asian persons in Canada. She's the author of Dance of Life, the mythology, history, and politics of Cambodian culture, and a co-author of the biography of Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen. Her recent major publications are Toronto's Multicultural Tongues, Stories of South Asian Cuisines, which appeared in Edible Histories, Cultural Politics, Towards the Food History of Canada, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2012. And she has book chapters in Narrating Race, Transnationalism, Social Change by Rodopi, and Writing Asia, the Literatures in Englishes from the Inside by the Ethos Books in Singapore. So with that, I hand it over to Julie.
Thank you, Harish. Salutations and felicitations. It gives me enormous pleasure on behalf of Rising Asia Journal and Rising Asia Foundation and founder and editor-in-chief Dr. Harish Mehta to welcome all of you across puddles and ponds and across geographies and histories to this international conference on diasporic Japanese writers, straddling haiku and zen. Some of our participants have woken up pretty much at the crack of dawn, what with the daylight saving, etc., to be with us, as have members of the audience. So thank you again for being here and being so patient. All the way from Sydney to Massachusetts to Toronto and all the way to India and Southeast Asia. Today is a celebration of several milestones. The Raj Raft Journal and Foundation celebrates, as Harish just told you, its second productive birthday with the publication of 6 issues of the Rising Asia Journal. So happy birthday, Raj. This year also marks the 15th year since Harish and I met and spent time with a Japanese-British diasporic phenomenon, Mr. Kazuo Ishiguro, Nobel laureate, who seems to be very much the focus of several of our presenters. We met in Toronto when he'd come to talk about his book, Never Let Me Go. Ever since, I have wished very much to host a seminar on diasporic writing. All good things demand perseverance and a sizable serving of patience. So here we are. 35 years ago, which seems like another lifetime really, Harish was awarded the Journalist of the Year award by Mitsubishi and an Asian media conglomerate when he was invited by the Japanese corporate to be resident in Japan and write a paper on Japan-China relations. My master's thesis from the University of Toronto was on Kazuo Ishiguro's Japanese novels, primarily on A Pale View Hills. So I guess there is a sizable Japanese connection that has been building up within us and which has now come to fruition. So glad we can share it with you. So the context of the conference, contemporary Japanese literature in English, is sweeping the world literary landscape with Kiryoku, a distinctive force that is passionate and indomitable, conjured as a kind of subtle and distilled minimalism, stories by diasporic Japanese authors in English about their left-behind home, Japan, or their newly adopted homes, have been slowly but pretty steadily gaining a faithful readership. It has burgeoned into some kind of a literary industry, so to speak, producing multilingual translations of stories by diasporic Japanese writers employing English. To invoke Homi Bhabha, the novelty of these tellings is in the, and I quote, the inscription, articulation of culture's hybridity. English seems to be an effective material to fill in the gaps, ellipses, hollows that were hidden in the nuanced cultural, should I say, complexities of Japan. And this performativity of English as a language often becomes a surprising facilitator It enables us, both the diasporic Japanese writer in English and the English language savvy reader, to unpack the riddle of Japanese thought and the mystery of Japanese culture. The post-Second World War Japanese diaspora has frequently drawn from the stalwarts of Japanese writing from the past and ushered in a kind of kindredness that undergirds the human condition, despite the embattled histories, residues of violence, fragmentation of memory, diversity in the world. A present-day writer, such as Haruki Murakami, for instance, has subtly incorporated in his works the thoughts of celebrated writers from Japan's rich past. And I'm talking Nobel Prize winner Yasunari Kawabata, the inimitable Meiji master Doppo Kunikida, the grandfather of the current literary movement. In his celebrated short story, Unforgettable People, Kunikida declared, and I quote, "And when this feeling strikes me, I find myself in tears, for in truth, there is then no self, no other. I'm touched by thought of each and everyone." With elegance and concision, writers of the past and others, Osamu Dazai, Riichi Yokomitsu, Soseki Natsume, Kenzaburo Ui, Kazuo Ishiguro, and now Haruki Murakami, Yoko Agawa, Ruto Zeki, Joy Kogawa, Keri Sakamoto, Hiromi Goto, Yoko Tawada have all carved themselves a lasting place on our multicultural planet. Super excited now to welcome our eminent and singularly exciting author, writer, professor of English, and our keynote lecturer, Professor Sheng Mei Ma from Michigan State University, who will be speaking on One Small Yellow Kid, One Giant Novelist, Deracination of Utkal's Clown and Ishiguro's Clones. The floor is all yours, Professor Ma.
One Small Yellow Kid, One Giant Novelist, Deracination of Utkal's Clown and Ishiguro's Clones. The title appears blasphemous when it borrows the astronaut Neil Armstrong's famous words prior to his moonwalk to suggest an analog, a parallelism between, on the one hand, the clown, Yellow Kid, from Richard F. Outcall's turn of the last century comics, Hogan's Alley, and on the other, the clones of Anglo-Japanese Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro's late novels. The anointed father of the American comic strips, Outcall teases with one small yellow kid who appears Irish. A century later, rises the esteemed novelist, whose protagonists of late appear to be clones, all white wannabes, ridding themselves futilely of any appearance of the post-human, any yellowish off-whiteness. The common thread lies in deracination, whereby characters are assumed to be white, their off-whiteness put under erasure, stricken through. This argument exhumes the yellowed bones of disappearances in distant comics and recent fictions. Outcall, through his Sunday Funny serialized in sensationalizing and tabloid-style yellow journalism, deracinates on several levels. From its etymological root of uprooting, deracination describes Outcall's Irish enclave of Hogan's Alley, inhabited by Irish immigrants and their descendants, some of whom are no doubt US born. Such white privilege has been internalized by Ishiguro, who emigrated with his parents from Japan to England at the age of 5. So immersed, so successful within the mainstream Anglophone culture is the novelist that any construct of Japanese-ness in early Ishiguro has been ethnically cleansed in late Ishiguro. Nevertheless, a latent sense of guilt de-alchemizes whitish leads since the remains of the day into lead or metallic stock characters who are neither real human nor non-human, like the Tin Man without a heart in The Wizard of Oz. The British butler Stevens from Remains comes to clone a long line of not quites, not human enough, not white enough, not man enough. Those who populate late Ishiguro includes repressed, possibly closeted, butlers in the employ of lords, genetically programmed clones for human organ transplants, and disposable robots with a limited shelf life. Arguably, this leap of faith from Aokau's clown to Ishiguro's clones speaks a species jumping by way of a hidden kinship of thematic deracination. Aokau takes white dominance for granted, cosplaying the yellow kid in whichever fashion that strikes his fancy from one Sunday to the next. I have several slides, but of course I'll just skip those. The cartoonist poetic license betrays white hegemony over the representations of minorities who are fetishized as Irish or not, as Chinese or not. The invisibility and omniscience of whiteness metastasizes into Ishiguro's off-white imposter syndrome, whereas Aokau elicits chuckles at the expense of the have-nots and the non-whites. Ishiguro continues this century-long laugh track in the Anglophone culture. Laughing so hard for so long only brings tears to the eyes. Consequently, teary smile invariably well up, one of Ishiguro's favorite phrasings from Inside Stevens and his doubles. One yellow kid dresses up as many in Aokau, many clones, undressed, bear one minority complex. And I think I'll just skip Aokau altogether and go directly to Clara and the Sun for the sake of time. To decode the sci-fi title's algorithm, Clara and the Sun deconstructs into Kei Ishiguro's Kei in Japan's sun goddess. Why else would each of the novella's books carry the blurb or author's note that invariably opens with, Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Nagasaki, Japan in 1954 and moved to Britain at the age of 5. This genesis anchors decades of enviable creativity in a birthplace soon replaced. To quote the title of a previous novel, out of this buried giant of childhood trauma of dislocation sprouts the novella's ove that continues as a repetition compulsion. Throughout the gallery of his misfit protagonists, from Japanese expatriates and failed artists to British butlers and apparently white clones and bots with AI, Ishiguro remains driven by the 5-year-old Japanese boys, Ishiguro's yellow kid, coming to terms with mourning and melancholia. Indeed, the Japanese child from Nagasaki must be retired for the substitute of the Anglophone novelist to arise. The paradigm for his fictional universe, girl AF, artificial friend Clara, arrives as the latest sci-fi manifestation of the Kafkaesque everyman K, the universality of whom secretes the particular disappearance of Japanese-ness. However, guilt haunts the identity flip. The more the novellist recycles the human condition via white-faced characters, the more repressed the psyche becomes over its off-whiteness, yellowishness. Guilt drives the novellist to honor these aging, completed, and used-up butlers, clones, and bots as more human than human, more British than the British, more white than whites, while leaving a breadcrumb trail of Yasujiro Ozu's family dramas, Chinaman figurines in Darlington Hall, samurai duels, all the way back into the future with the Shinto sun goddess that solar powers Clara. It is in the nature of fetishism that a fetishist and fans simultaneously acknowledge the loss while disavowing any such knowledge. Factory-made and store-bought, Clara remains sired imaginatively by the parents of Kafka and E.T.A. Hoffman's. Kafka's K is wedded to Hoffman's robot, Clara, with a C, of course. In The Sandman, Hoffman's protagonist Nathaniel is smitten by an exquisitely made automaton, Olympia. Increasingly obsessed with Olympia, Nathaniel finds his fiancée Clara's calm, cool-headed temperament insufferably cold and prosaic, to the extent that he burst out, and I quote, you damn lifeless automaton." The shift of attachment from a real person to a machine carries a further clue in the story's opening, and I quote, "Dark forebodings of some awful fate threatening me are spreading themselves out over my head like black clouds, impenetrable to every friendly ray of sunlight." The sun of rationality and humanity meets the black sun of the post-human in the German romanticist. The cosmopolitan Ishiguro universalizes this dystopic vision through the wellspring of Western literary tradition, all the while displacing the Shinto sun goddess that is believed to be the genesis of Japan. Consistently throughout his career, anything Japanese is deflected now onto ecological exigencies of Clara running out of solar energy. In this latest round of reincarnation, the lost child, capital L, capital C, the lost child is Clara, invoked no longer in flesh and blood, but in synthetics and chemical fluid, such as PEG9 solution for brain matter. Clara is purchased by the mother from the manager, all capitalized M, for the express purpose of accompanying Josie, a teenager whose eugenic age, AGE, capitalized, artificial genetic editing, has the side effect of chronic illness, potentially deadly. A youngish, pubescent robot with artificial intelligence, Clara is designed to provide companionship for troubled teenagers. Ishiguro gives scarce physical description of AFs in the same way that humans deign to elaborate on the specifications of tools, which matter only in terms of their functions. In fact, even the composition of synthetics and fluids is inferred from Clara's function in having part of her brain's gray matter, as it were, drained through a puncture of her synthetic skin behind her ear in order to destroy a Kunning's machine as a bargain to save Josie. Otherwise, readers would have no idea what Clara is made of. Clara sacrifices her brain matter to incapacitate the city's air-fouling, pale yellow Kunning's machine in exchange for Josie's recovery. In her silent incantation, Clara vows to the sun, capitalized to befit its singularity and omnipotence, as Ishiguro has done with clones in Never Let Me Go, that she would vandalize Cootings to win back Josie's health. Unbeknownst to the childlike Clara, Cootings machines, so named after the company logo on a contraption, are probably for the construction and operation of the city, no different from the genetic engineering that both lifted Josie's and her elder sister Sally's mental capacity and aged them prematurely, actually killing Sally, her elder sister. Like a double-edged sword, science and technology build the city and pollute it. They create super children and rob them of life. The duality even jumps from the yellowness of the sun to that of Cootings, from AF's imagined solar friend to AF's imagined yellow peril. The name of Cootings brings to mind cooties, after children's head lice, deployed by the Filipino-American graphic artist Linda Barry's 100 Demons, where cooties and white kudo make constant appearances. Cooties in Barry's autobiographical drawings, quote, didn't mean mice. It meant something that you was so weird that no one wanted to touch anything you touch. I was one of the little cootie girls, end quote. Note the schizophrenia in the second person you that distances from the explainer, only to have the you overlap with the I in the end. The key words in italics, that I just quoted to you, deviate from the regular font, only to be applied to the speaker who italicizes. With Sally's early demise, the mother tries to fill the emotional void with a Dr. Capote's clone, Sal, which failed as miserably as Hoffman's Olympia. A machinic daughter to alchemist eye maker, doll maker, Coppola Copernicus. Besides Clara, Ishiguro also mirrors the mad scientist character of his German forefather. Organic to a certain extent, Clara evidently stays true to her mission, her appearance never changing. Clara does not grow as Josie grows out of her physical illness and moves away for college in the concluding pages. In the last farewell, a much taller Josie, quote, had to crouch a little, resting her chin on my left shoulder, end quote. Resting on the petite shoulder is not only Josie's chin, but Josie's whole being, a reversal of aging parents and university-bound freshman children. Josie bids farewell, blithely unaware of her miraculous recovery at the expense of Clara's mental capacity and regressive infantilization. Told in the first-person perspective, Clara and the son stays tightly within the robot's limited understanding, as boxed in as Clara's resegmented vision. From a child's eye view of the world from below, so much so that it resembles a buck's eye view, the fiction lacks the big picture available to adults from a bird's eye view. Yet this claustrophobic, tunneled vision endows the novel with a fresh, uncanny tenor, all the more endearing because of Clara's kindness of hearts, her blank slate of a mind devoid of human desires. On this instrument of tabula rasa is projected human characters' longing, even cold-heartedness. The robotic scan from Clara's eyes surfaces in her early perception of the manager and the store in which she and other AFs are being displayed like commodities of slaves at an auction block. And I quote, the space had become partitioned in 10 boxes. In one box, the manager was visible only from her waist to the upper part of her neck, while the box immediately beside it was almost entirely taken up by her eyes. The eye closest to us was much larger than the other, but both were filled with kindness and sadness. Yet, A third box showed a part of her jaw and most of her mouth, and I detected there anger and frustration. End quote. A grotesque and gothic dissection of none other than the mother figure to all the AFs. The manager's contradictory emotions are externalized, flattened, and framed. Despite the resemblance to a child's limited vision and understanding, the segmenting reveals the stark contrast of the manager's appearance of sad kindness and repression of angry frustration. Moreover, the piecemeal view evokes how commodities or slaves are assessed before the sale, namely in itemized specifications and embodied parts. It examines humans in the exact manner as humans examine it. Put another way, whereas a product like AF arrives in a box, so to speak, Josie's real life come true. Sorry,
You have another minute?
Yeah,
A minute or two, that's fine.
Okay, I'll just conclude very, very quickly. However, fantastically, this ending culminates Clara's use value as a companion for Josie and a possible substitute upon Josie's death, orchestrated by Dr. Capote. In preparation for the sci-fi cosplay of Josie 2.0, the mother even goes so far as to beseech Clara to inhabit Stephen's trade secret for butlers. Josie wants to inhabit Josie once she is gone, to start calling her honey repeatedly, and to give a maternal hug in the car. The last gesture portends physical replacement that never comes to pass, neither in the vehicle with car equipment separating us, nor in life when the child mother, Clara, sacrifices herself. Not just the mannerism, but also the human heart of Josie's that the mother impresses upon Clara to acquire only prove how heartless, egotistic humans are, contrasted by Clara giving freely of her life. This melancholic j'accuse against humanity displaces the Anglophone nobella's guilt over raising the yellow kid from an iron box, back into which the 5-year-old retires upon completion of each repetition compulsion. Thank you very much. I think I'll just stop right here.
Thank you so much, Professor Ma. That was so insightful and loved your perspectives. And may I just say that I kept the best for the last of Professor Ma's explication. You can see what a mind he has. And as I said, he is the author of over a dozen books, including The Tao of S, 2022, Off-White, 2020, Sinophone, Anglophone Cultural Duet, 2017, The Last Style, 2015, Alien English, 2014, Asian Diaspora and East-West Modernity, 2012, Diaspora Literature and Visual Culture, 2011, East-West Montage, 2007, The Deathly Embrace, 2000, Immigrant Subjectivities in Asian American and Asian Diaspora Literatures, 1998, Memoir of Immigrant Horse's Mouth, 2023, co-editor of 5 books and special issues, Transnational Narratives in Englishes of Exile, 2018 among them. He also published a collection of poetry in Chinese, 30 Left and Right. That is a breathless litany. Thank you so very much. Trivikraman Nair. She's the Associate Professor of English, Government Sanskrit College at the University of Kerala. And her paper is titled Literary Representation of Folk Tales, Affirmation of Self and Identity in Selected Poems of Lee and Roripo. Chitra is an academic. She's a bilingual poet anchored in Kerala, India. She's Associate Professor of English, Thiruvananthapuram, and is also a research supervisor in English at the University of Kerala. She's published a number of research articles in indexed, refereed national and international journals and books, and is on the editorial board of 2 prominent journals. Also a member of various academic organizations, she's a member of the Board of Studies in Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Kerala. Her poems in English have been published in various journals and anthologies. She has to her credit 2 poetry anthologies in English, Shades of Life 2021, published by the Third Eye Butterfly Press, Florida, and Rhythmic Retreats and 2021. So with that, Arish, I hand the baton over to you.
Thank you very much. Since Dr. Chitra Nair can't be here, she sent her paper here, which I should read now. Literary representation of folk tales, affirmation of self and identity in the select poems of Leanne Roripo. It is an established fact that the unique traits and characteristics of a specific geographical region is attributed to its peculiar cultural values, beliefs, local customs and practices, religious rituals, and traditional heritage with its strong ethos of the land. In this respect, folktales play a vital role in keeping alive the traditional practices and cultural beliefs and values unique to a land or community, and it lives forever in the storytelling activities of a community that are transmitted from generation to generation. As an illuminatory resource of traditional wisdom and shared knowledge, and being deeply entrenched in the religious ethos of a nation, folk tales go a long way in their socio-cultural history, thus paving the way for a rich body of oral literature. As a national treasure of universal value, these folk tales transmitted across generations, mainly by view of oral storytelling, are repositories offering critical insights into a society's cultural and social values and meanings, and also as markers of a shared collective consciousness. Socio-cultural implications of folk tales have triggered an interest in the production of a number of literary works in recent times, which have dealt with the exploration of mythical elements and legends signifying a country's entire social and cultural history and its impact on the diasporic consciousness. The research paper endeavors to understand how the folk tales, with its attendant rich traditions and strong religious cultural beliefs, which investigate into the past impact, the quintessential consciousness of the diasporic communities scattered across the globe. Attempts to continuously relate and personally reflect on the resilient histories of socio-cultural experiences offered by the rich folktale traditions of the Japanese American diaspora, as can be seen in the poems of Leanne Roripo. Her poems exemplify the need to rediscover Japanese folk tales from a dual perspective of a woman that is of a Japanese American heritage, with reference to the select poems in her second book of poems, The Year of the Snake, 2004. First coined by William J. Thomas in 1846, the term folklore signifies the thoughts, ideas, customs, and traditions of people affiliated to a particular social, cultural, and religious group. In recent times, with the increasing volume of travel trade, technological and communication advancements across the globe, there has arisen a resurgent need to revisit and reinterpret the folk tales, which are viewed as repositories of collective and personal experiences of a particular sect, community, or land. In Japan, as in India, the folk tales are an integral part of society and culture. The Japanese folk tales and myths are a conglomeration of ceremonies, customs, practices, and cultural beliefs found in the Shinto and Buddhist religions. In their entirety, these folk tales offer a holistic and comprehensive knowledge about the Japanese society of the erstwhile times. Having come under the influence of political factions, these folk tales are preserved in two books, Kokiji and Nihon Shyoki, transmitted orally across generations and rooted in local linguistic dialects. Japanese folk tales, consciously or unconsciously, turn out to bear the traditions of a land. Globalization has had its repercussions in Japan too, and many people from Japan formed part of the migratory movements to European countries, most strikingly the United States. Now, unlike in the case of the first generation immigrants across the globe, the Japanese also carried memories of their native folk tales and sustained transnational relations with their homeland. With fast-paced urbanization and the industrialization following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, mainly Japanese were forced to leave their homeland as a result of which migratory trends were at their peak in the first half of the 20th century. Socio-cultural implications behind these diasporic movements came to be reflected in the literature of the time. The dynamic of the complex relationships of the Japanese diaspora with the new land needs to be understood in terms of their ways in tackling the contours of space, time, and identity. Questions pertaining to spatial and temporal identities vary across generations and individuals. One of the significant voices in the field of Asian American diasporic literature, Leanne Roripo, a prolific writer who has authored 5 volumes of poetry. She is the recipient of a 2003 Artist Fellowship of the Archibald Bush Foundation and a 1995 Randall Jarrell International Poetry Prize. Her writing is remarkable for their representation of folk tales from the feminist and diasporic perspective, doubly. In Snake Wife and Snake Bridegroom, Roripo presents folk tales about the snake, which evidently displays her fondness for such folk tales, yet succeeds in evoking emotions of fear and dreadfulness. Imitating the original story of Hebi Nyobo, Snake Wife presents a female snake and her body from a female perspective. Parallels are drawn between the beauty of the female body and that of the snake, and as Roripo describes, from the very start, you were charmed by the uncoiling languor of my shifting poses, by the sibilant lisp of silk sliding down in my undulant length of spine as I shed the intricate layers of my kimono. This is from page 55. In this poem, the delicate status and restricted role played by women in the Japanese society, which is male-centric, with their hopes and aspirations and being controlled by the dominant patriarchal structures, and where women are expected to downplay their strengths. Their individualities are least respected, with their lives being smothered under the inbuilt patriarchal pressure. Gender politics underlying the complex relationships of social norms relegate the Japanese woman to a subservient position, which can be traced back to these folk tales where women characters were presented as leading a subservient, obliging, and slavish existence. The secondary status accorded to Japanese women, as seen in folk tales, invites comparison with that of their Indian counterparts, such as Manusmriti, which focus on the asymmetrical nature of gender relations. It is interesting to note that the beginnings of gender disparity leading to the creation of a stable gender identity can be found in folk tales where gender performativity is reinforced. As part of our attempts to highlight the significance of women in relationships, Roripo engages in a creative reconstruction of the original folk tales where women occupy the center stage. Snakes are an integral part of the Japanese social cultural space. Snakes are presented as symbols of eternity and fertility, and their worship is followed as a tradition in many countries, including Japan and India. Worshipped as embodiments of poisonous beauty, snakes are treated as embodiments of are treated as revered creatures in Japanese folk tales. The primordial relation of the snakes to the humans cannot be understated, as it contributes in a significant way in understanding the society of the times. Japanese society is no exception to this, as folk tales form the basis of its tradition and culture, and in the process of rediscovering its beauty, Roripo takes a cue from the serpent bridegroom folktale to present the sensuous beauty and romantic attraction of the female characters, and by extension, is applied to the poet herself. The metamorphosis of the female psyche following pregnancy is vividly described, and the poet says, I could feel my womb twisting and writhing, full of serpents, until one day it was too much for me to bear. I stabbed myself with a chopstick and set them free to slither out, where my restless spirit would follow them through grass and trees back up into the mountains. This is from pages 23 and 24. As a woman, the physical and psychic transformations of herself are brought out clearly by Roripo in the poem. Notions of romance and sensuousness associated with Western folk literary traditions are conveniently adapted by Roripo to the Japanese folk tales. The binary divisions between the divine and the human are characteristic of Japanese folk tales. In Snake Bridegroom, the snake-human relationship based on love and romance is presented. As a poet, Roripo does not completely and freely adapt to the folk tales, as we find in the case of Roripo's female characters, who are presented as autonomous beings with a free self and endowed with imaginative capacities. Not bound by the conventional traditions and cultural practices, her characters are presented as inhabiting a free personal space wherein they follow their own liberated path of sensuous life. Instead of being tied down to domestic duties, these characters lead a carefree life, feeding their senses and satisfying their emotions. As Roripo puts it in Tongue Cut Sparrow, once I was a sparrow caught trespassing in your back garden, and you made me your pet, feeding me satin seeds of tear-shaped sesame from the tip of your finger, blowing your warm breath in the tender hollows beneath the curve of my wings. That's from section 50. Passionate love forms the core of Orihime's song, in which the sensuous desires of Orihime to get united with her lover is brought out. By rewriting these folk tales, Roripo effectively transforms the stories into a feminist narrative in which the traditional women characters are presented as engaged in serious attempts to get liberated and free from the clutches of tradition. Through these characters, Roripo attempts at empowering and liberating them from the dominant clutches of patriarchal powers. Roripo's poems can be viewed as literary exercises, wherein she revisits old traditions of these folk tales and tries to recontextualize those stories to suit the needs of the times. With its strong roots in oral traditions, the folk tales have emerged as important sites of challenge, wherein the dominant oral folklore narratives are called into question and necessary alterations are effected. Writers such as Roripo are therefore engaged in zealous efforts to negotiate a space for women who have been subjugated and smothered since eons, and forced to live on the margins without a voice of their own. In Fishwife, Roripo subverts the traditional discourses of gender relations, as we may find the female character punishing her male counterpart for doubting her, and even goes to the extent of gifting him a box of evil things. Before I left, I gave you a lacquerware box so heavy you'd think it would be worth my weight in gold. I packed it full of earthworms and damsel flies, bumblebee wings, and gleaming coils of fine silk twine. That's from pages 65 and 66. Rather than forcing traditional roles on the female characters, and instead of resorting to the familiar constructions of gender identity, which is one's individual belief that he or she is neither male or female, we find Rory Pog's female characters displaying a sense of nonconformity to socially constructed, stereotyped roles. Rory Poe's diasporic self forces her to revisit her homeland, conceptualized in terms of myths, folktales, and legends centered on Japanese cultural traditions. As Diane Perkis rightly observes, for feminists, the rewriting of myths denotes participation in these historical processes, and the struggle to alter gender asymmetries agreed upon for centuries by myths disseminators. When feminists envisage that struggle, they often think of the rewriting as reinterpretation of individual stories. For example, by changing the focus of the narrative form, a male character to a female character, or by shifting the terms of the myth so that what was a negative female role model becomes a positive one. A sense of identity as a woman gets further reinforced when she relates herself to her homeland. Being a diasporic writer, Rory Poe's diasporic experiences offer alternative paradigms for expression of her native self, where her roots are recreated and reinterpreted to reiterate the essential sense of her being. Her works strike the readers as expression of reclaiming a space for women in the narrative fabric, where she tries to challenge the asymmetric nature of power relations inherent in Japanese society. The end.
Most impressive, Harish. Thank you very much for that. Anushka, Zainab, Shirsha, Mohini, isn't it kind of coincidental how we were just talking about Julia Kristeva and the powers of horror the other day, and all that in The Snake Wife comes through so beautifully in Rory Poe's poetry. Would you not agree?
Ma'am, so when we are so involved in our own cultures, we have this lens of blaming only what we see. But when we actually move beyond, we see that it's everywhere. So, like this presentation reminded me that whatever you do not like, there are reflections of it everywhere. You just need to seek out what you think is true.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. Snigdha Mishra is from the University of Hyderabad. And Snigdha is an MPhil English research scholar at the University of Hyderabad, presently working on the themes of guilt and responsibility in the early novels of Kazuo Ishiguro from a narratological perspective. She did her BA honors in English and MA English from Jadavpur University in Kolkata. And apart from narrative studies, her other areas of interest include environmental humanities and medical humanities. How narrative forms get adapted to accommodate such contemporary interdisciplinary themes is something that excites her. She would like to believe that the field of humanities and literature has a lot to offer in our current struggle with the myriad crises facing the 21st century and the ever-growing vulnerabilities that emanate from them. It is in this precise space that Snigdha would like to place her future research. Besides the aforementioned academic interests, she is an avid lover of books, music, and animated movies of all kinds. Snigdha, your interest in the two books, the two novels of Ishiguro, which are the only two Japanese-based novels, will bring, I think, a debate, at least if not today, definitely tomorrow, because a lot of us are invested in why including the keynote speaker for today, Professor Ma, on the deracination that you find in uh, the Nobel laureate's first two novels. So go ahead, we are listening and very excited.
All right, so hello, my name is Nita Mishra. I am an MPhil scholar from the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. Today's paper is actually a work in progress based on a section of one of my thesis chapters. The title of my talk is Ishiguro's Other Worlds, exploring the theme of guilt through reading Ishiguro's early novels as diasporic confessionals. This paper will examine Kazuo Ishiguro's first two novels, A Pale View of Hills and An Artist of the Floating World, as an inquiry into the narrative strategy of othering and how it functions as a marker of guilt as a theme in the said novels. I define this othering as the transformation of select spatial frames within the narrative universe into othered spaces, where guilt operates in an associative manner, insofar as the narrator's guilt emerges out of their relationship with the spaces they inhabit. In this way, guilt acts as a sign whose meaning is constructed and understood relationally across many signifiers. While the margins that the autodiegetic narrators of the novels are forced to occupy in their present point to an atmosphere of social blame, I explore how the creation of these othered spaces is dependent not just on their geographical location, but also their waning cultural significance in the post war society of Japan, as well as the waning relevance of the hierarchies emplaced within these spaces. In addition, I also explore how Ishiguro uses the socio-cultural environment of Japan in conjunction with the narrative strategies of telling and manipulations of language, which add to the creation of these other spaces. In my reading, the setting works in tandem with the narratological techniques utilized in the novels. Finally, I'll also draw upon Ishiguro's third work, The Remains of the Day, to establish that this narrative strategy of othering can be read universally across writings of the confessional mode, and that Ishiguro does not necessarily use it only for his novels which are based in Japan. Uh, what I aim to study in this paper, as a term, as a term like space has its own manifold critical implications, I think it is imperative that I mention that when I refer to spaces, I mean narrative spaces, and specifically spatial frames in the narrative. Spatial frames, as described in narrating space, spatializing narrative, are the immediate surroundings of the characters, the shifting scenes of action that may flow into each other. This is a more defined territory as opposed to something like the narrative universe, which is a deeper level of narrative space and constitutes the world presented as actual by the text, plus also the counterfactual worlds constructed by characters as beliefs, wishes, fears, speculations, hypothetical thinking, dreams, fantasies, and imaginative creations. I shall look into the aspect of placemaking, which entails identifying, designating, defining, building, using, interpreting, or remembering of a place. As Edward Soja defined, places are doubly constructed. Most are built in some way or physically carved out, but they are also narrated, interpreted, perceived, felt, understood, and imagined. Thus, I'm looking at select spatial frames such as Sachiko and Etsuko's houses and post war Nagasaki in A Pale View of Hills, Masuji Ono's house and the pleasure district in An Artist of the Floating World, and Darlington Hall in The Remains of the Day for their material forms, but especially the human investment with meaning and value. Since this paper also focuses on the narrative strategies in these novels, the autodiegetic narration and the autodiegetic narrators also form the focus of the study. It is a Gerard Genet term and is one of his diegetic levels based on the distinction between narrators who do or did participate in the events of the story and those who do not or did not participate. Jeanette calls the first kind homodiegetic and the second heterodiegetic. An alternative terminology for this distinction would be James Philance's character narrator and non character narrator. Homodiegetic narrators who are protagonists are autodiegetic narrators. In the case of this paper, Etsuko, Masuji Ono, and Stevens are all autodiegetic narrators who are individuals past their prime, reminiscing of bygone events in their life and trying to come to terms with the role they played in them. Research questions. How can confessional writing be chosen as a framework for these novels for the purpose of this study? What is the nature of guilt that we are looking at in these Ishiguro novels, and does the framework of the confessional help in establishing this theme at the level of the form? How do we break down the process or phenomenon of the creation of othered spaces? What are the strategies utilized by Ishiguro in these novels which come together to form set sites of guilt? What other themes can be a scope of further research and discussion that this paper can help facilitate? I go over the theme of responsibility very briefly, which is where I take this conversation to in my thesis. It basically forms my next chapter. All right. So, coming to the framework of the confessional, I am choosing to study these novels within the literary generic framework of confessional writing. The rationale behind that stems from the fact that in all three novels, the narrators do not offer a mere chronological history of their past, but present the remembrance as a means to understand and introspect. They also address a hypothetical narrative throughout, making the narration a performance of private experience. For Foucault, the act of confession is a ritual of discourse in which the speaking subject is also the subject of the statement. It is also a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship. For one does not confess without the presence or virtual presence of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor but the authority who requires the confession, prescribes and appreciates it, and intervenes in order to judge, punish, forgive, console, and reconcile. In these novels, on the one hand, we encounter the speaker believing himself or herself to be telling the truth, while another truth emerges from the reading, and on the other hand, we have the narrator's unyielding desire to tell. The need to understand the self contends with the need to manage the image in front of an audience as the reasoning behind this desire to bear all. Thus, the autodiegetic narration in these works is not an objective recounting, but a subjective reconstruction in the making. Okay. In the Routledge Encyclopedia of Narrative Theory, Peter Brooks distinguishes the confessional from the memoir for their implication in the former that the speaker or writer wishes or even needs to reveal something that is hidden, possibly shameful, and difficult to articulate. As mentioned before, the ideas around the narrator's self and past that get constructed in the process of narration are incongruous with what the narrator often tries to imply through the subject matter of his tale or telling. The incongruity is therefore between the intent and the effect of the narration, the latter compromising the integrity of the narrator. And this is the first marker of guilt as a palpable theme in these novels. Also, confessional as a mode constitutes a subgenre of the novel in which problems of truth telling and self recognition, deception, and self deception come to the forefront. Reading these novels as confessionals becomes imperative because the confessional narrative, as opposed to a memoir, makes use of the formal structure of remembering in conjunction with the strategies of telling and retelling. Ishiguro's narrators are self deceptive in ways quite detectable to the reader. It reinforces the rhetoric of the genre, which involves a kind of hide and seek, where the reader finds what is confessed by the narrator to not be the whole truth. This incongruence aids the storytelling by bringing into play the dynamic of disclosure and concealment. All right, shifting to the first novel. In An Artist of the Floating World, disgraced artist Masuji Ono's narration around the subject of his youngest daughter's marriage negotiations repeatedly meanders into pre war reminiscence and anecdotes of his renown. Perhaps the biggest marker of his renown in his house is his house, whose description is what the novel opens with. If on a sunny day you climb the steep path leading up from the little wooden bridge still referred to around here as the Bridge of Hesitation, you will not have to walk far before the roof of my house becomes visible between the tops of two ginkgo trees. Even if it did not occupy such a commanding position on the hill, the house would still stand out from all others nearby, so that as you come up the path, you may find yourself wondering what sort of wealthy man owns it. But then I am not, nor have I, ever been a wealthy man. The imposing air of the house will be accounted for, perhaps, if I inform you that it was built by my predecessor and that he was none other than Akira Sugimura. Ono's house's stature is not merely physical in nature. From the very beginning, Ono's narration uses certain words in conjunction with the house. He talks about how, despite being in the peak of his career, he could buy the house not through wealth but through an auction of prestige, where he was chosen and emerged the winner. Prestige is marked as a different kind of currency in the pre war Japanese market, which is pitted against conventional wealth and held at a higher regard. This is indicated by how Sugimura's daughters found even the discussion of finances distasteful during the exchange. The fact that a man like Akira Sugimura, who was one of the city's most influential and well respected men before the war, deemed Ono worthy of the house based on his good character and achievement was what the house stood for. Ono's narration attributes prestige and glory in an associative fashion. While Ono and Sugimura both were well respected men, Sugimura's approval of Ono through their mutual association with the house validated Ono's status. This is reflected in Ono's pupil's somewhat exaggerated respect, which initially fueled his desire to buy the house. It is also necessary to note that, in extension to the quality of prestige, the house is also linked to the prospect of orthodox marriage negotiations in the novel. In the society inhabited by Ono, marriage negotiations are carried out between families of equal esteem. Status, or the distinction or reputation of the family, is an important point of consideration. This association is stressed in the novel when Ono's wife convinces him to buy the house because of the, and I quote, importance of our having a house in keeping with our status for marriage prospects, unquote. When the auction of prestige for the house turns into a long drawn process which involves many background checks from the Sugimura family, Ono and his wife look at it as cumbersome but necessary and note how it is, I quote, very similar to a marriage negotiation, unquote. They treat it as practice for their own daughter's marriage negotiations in the future. Moreover, when Ono's wife objects to the demeaning background checks, he says, I quote, we have nothing we would not want them to discover, unquote. Through these continuous deliberate allusions in Ono's narration, the house therefore becomes representative of prestige in Ono's society, as well as a marker of successful marriage negotiation. In fact, it also validates Ono's reputation as an artist, because during the house's acquisition, Sugimura's youngest daughter comments, I quote, our father was a cultured man. He had much respect for artists. He knew of your work, unquote. However, while Ono might surreptitiously slip one tale after the other of the high esteem accorded to him in the past, there is no denying that the central anxiety in the novel arises out of the difficulties of marrying off his daughter. In direct opposition to his comments to his wife in the past regarding them having nothing to hide, the Ono we encounter during the course of narration is engaged in vigorous image management that operates at the level of character actions as well as storytelling. He tries to track down an old student to convince him to give a favorable review to his daughter's prospective in laws, so that he would not mention Ono's involvement with the imperialist regime. The narrative contrast with the space of the house he inhabits in the present is disparaging. While the house still remains and is occupied by the same owner, it no longer stands for its original associations. Instead, the house is constructed into a subversive space, an othered space. It is only made possible by the substantial positive values which the narration associates with the space to begin with, elevating its status in the narrative into a signifier or a space of representation from an ordinary inactive object or site. The social moral value in these novels is transferred in an osmotic fashion, as it were, between the guilty subject and the elements of his spatial surroundings, which include both the inanimate physical site of their actions and the human characters associated with them. Is a sign whose meaning is constructed and understood relationally across many signifiers. These othered spaces also function through the waning significance of the position or hierarchy of these narrators within these sites. Ono holds the position of a failed artist during the moment of narration, as imperialist propaganda paintings are detested in the post war Japanese society, and men like Ono are scorned for having led Japan into war. Ono's house does not just accommodate the lonely figure of Ono and his younger daughter, whose marriage proposals keep falling through because of Ono's currently hated position. It also houses the room where he keeps his propaganda paintings hidden, the cause behind his disgrace. For characters who have spent a majority of their days attaching their self worth to their professions and professional commitments, to hold the position of an obsolete job is very alienating. It brings to our attention the stark change in perception that has taken place over the years and the marginal places the narrators currently occupy in the moment of narration. It begs the question what exactly went wrong, thereby establishing the narrator's implicit guilt for the readers. These othered spaces are also constructed through the lack of social interactions in these places. One such example in the novel is the pleasure district in Japan, which was earlier the hub of artists where Ono commanded extreme relevance and reverence. It is apparent that most of his friends and pupils do not frequent the pleasure district anymore. Some have even outright severed ties with Ono and the places he frequents. The social blame is another element which helped in the construction of these sites of guilt. Okay. I go to the remains of the day for a while now, just to universalize this othering. In the remains of the day, Darlington Hall, similarly, is a primary spatial frame in the narrative which represents an othered space. Since Lord Darlington went down in the annals of history as someone responsible for historical catastrophe, as a place, this disgrace befalls the house even though it no longer houses Lord Darlington. By living in Darlington Hall, this reputation extends to Stevens, the butler, by association, even though he serves a different master now. Darlington Hall, as an othered space, casts the shadow of blame on Stevens, who cannot detach himself from Lord Darlington's deeds till he continues to serve the House. His position as a marginal eyewitness is both the source of insider's information on what is a culturally acknowledged and condemned fact, a reinforcement through details of what is considered already known, and the cause of moral discomfort in terms of this continued existence into the altered power dynamic of the social space or spaces he occupies. Similarly, similar to the subversion of Ono's house, when Stevens took over the duties of butlership from his aged father, serving a place like Darlington Hall was an aspiration in the butler community. Dignity is the counterpart of prestige in this particular work. This is brought up multiple times in the course of the narration when Stevens names of great butlers always in tandem with the houses they served. This suggests a cultural understanding of a code of service that exists across generations as well as spatial locations. It is symbolized by the great houses that are all held in comparison with one another. In Stevens's world, greatness is derived from the place one serves. Again, the value prestige of the household one serves is determined relationally alongside other similar households. They all serve as signs in a system of honor and prestige that accrues to those who belong to them. But it also means serving Darlington Hall after the disgrace that has befallen it automatically alienates him from the community of great butlers. Also, the current owner of Darlington Hall, as in during the course of narration, is an American named Mr. Faraday, who essentially does not even belong to the tradition of lords. Stevens is an aging butler in a world where butlership is a dying profession. Again, like Ono, we have the waning relevance of the narrator's position within the other side, propelling the alienation further. Darlington Hall also does not house the international conferences it used to once, and the lack of important social functions brings to our attention the current state of it, almost comparable to a ghost house. Coming to A Pale View of Hills, which is Ishiguro's first work, in A Pale View of Hills, this othering as a means to establish guilt is a little complicated because the narrator Etsuko reminisces of a summer in Nagasaki when she was pregnant with her first child. The novel traverses between her memories of the summer and her present life in England. Through Etsuko's memories, we are introduced to the mother daughter duo of Sachiko and Mariko, whose story bears an uncanny resemblance to how things unfolded between Etsuko and her own daughter, Keiko. There is a parallel trajectory suggestive of the unreliable nature of Etsuko's narration, and it is hinted that it stems from projecting her guilt regarding Keiko's fate onto Sachiko and Mariko. It is then a psychological doubling, mirrored also in the correspondences and echoes between the plot trajectories of the two characters through the narrative strategy of a conversation or dialogue between the self and the other. Since Sachiko and Mariko are the objects of the guilty projection, it is the space occupied by them which is turned into an othered site. They live in a war torn, dilapidated hut separated from the apartments of well to do residents in Nagasaki, like Etsuko. It mirrors the derisive treatment they receive from other residents and the fact that they do not get along with other people. Peter Sloane notes how the fact that Sachiko's hut is towered upon by all the other apartments in that area is also indicative of how Sachiko is looked down upon by the residents of the apartments. And although there is no profession that Etsuko fails at, it is her apparent failure in the discourse which she subscribes to, the discourse of motherhood, that functions akin to that of Ono and Stevens within these other sites. It is also worth mentioning that the character of Ogata san, although not the protagonist, is the precursor to the character of Ono and Stevens. Ogata san is Etsuko's former father in law who comes to visit them during the summer. He is a disgraced teacher who is looked down upon by the present generation for his primitive modes of teaching. He too is estranged from the place of his birth, Nagasaki, and his son Jiro. The alienation of geographical places, when they're not the places you want them to be, is also expressed in the story by Ogata san, who says, at the end of it all, one still wants to go back to where one grew up. It reminds the reader that Etsuko's narration comes from a country far away from her own, where she lost her daughter to suicide. Um, okay, this is this is where I end it. But with I'll like to go over a little over the scope of further discussion from this paper. I'll end this presentation with a little insight into what I think stems from the discussion started in this paper. I think a significant part in the creation of these other sites is the shift in values with respect to time and how that establishes guilt. The difference in values and value systems between the storytelling characters and the other characters in the story is a significant marker of the incriminatory nature of the narrator's values. What was earlier acceptable or even commendable is no longer held in that light. In an interview, Ishiguro identifies this as a major concern of his fiction. How people justify to themselves the kind of life they have led, how they try to do something that will give their lives some kind of dignity, to do something and then have to come to terms with their ordinariness. Therefore, I'm interested in historical periods that are topsy turvy, where people who have spent their whole lives doing something are suddenly told it's wrong. The things they could be proud of are suddenly something to be ashamed of. Unquote. I follow this discussion up with the theme of responsibility and different kinds of responsibility in Ishiguro in my thesis, but I hope people can take the discussion up in many other forms. Thank you. That's all. I hope I
Thank you.
made sense.
Yes, you brought up some really interesting points about the genre of the confessional and the responsibility aspect. And I'm looking forward to having a longer conversation with you, with all of us. Thank you very much, Snigdha. Absolutely fascinating. Vivian Taylor is up next from Claremont Graduate University. Vivian earned her Cultural Studies MA with a concentration in Media Studies from Claremont Graduate University. She adds this to her Film Studies Creative Writing MFA from National University and her English BA from the University of Georgia with an African American Studies certificate. Vivian has worked and traveled globally, including China, South Korea, India, Italy, Spain, and Colombia, among other nations. She applies a transdisciplinary socio-political approach, uses native language sources in her comparative arts research. Her work centers on oppressive regime structures, healing trauma through the arts, and historical amnesia, with the reclamation of memory and recreation of individual and national identities. What language best expresses grief, fragmentation, and reconnection in Ryusuke Hamaguchi's film Drive My Car? Go ahead, Vivian, we are all eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you to Harish and Julie for organizing this wonderful concept for this conference. It's very refreshing and original as well. So the title of this project is What Language Best Expresses Grief? And so we are centering on the concepts of language and expression and the ideas of grief and, of course, healing and overcoming grief. And looking at characters who are fragmented and how they go through the process of reconnecting with society, with themselves, and with other individuals. And we're using as the vehicle for this exploration the Japanese film Drive My Car. So, which was produced in 2021 and won multiple awards. And so this film was based off of a short story by the very famous Japanese author Haruki Murakami. Murakami was born in 1949, and he's often known for doing very magically real novels and stories. I've read one of his novels, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which was published in 1995. And that book is very magically real. There's like a time tunnel, and people can travel into different dimensions and things like that. And it does have a male center protagonist, and there are some peripheral female characters and who are not very well developed. And I just wanted to bring up those two elements of this novel to talk about how this movie and the short story are quite different from Murakami's other works, but there's also connections. So the film, based on this short story, Drive My Car, is directed by the Japanese director, Hamaguchi. And Hamaguchi was born in 1978. He's directed a few films, but I'd like to focus on one film called Happy Hour, which was produced in 2015. And this film is about like 4 hours long, and it centers on a group of women. And so Hamaguchi has kind of a history of really creating very complex female characters. And in some ways, this can juxtapose one of the main criticisms of Murakami's work of not creating developed female characters. So, although I love Murakami, I still am a huge devotee of his wonderful works. So in moving forward, we're looking at this film, A Drive My Car, which has a very transnational cast. And as I considered how to create a research project on this film, I thought about Bakhtin's theory of polyphony and to apply that as a theoretical framework. And so in Bakhtin's famous critical theory text, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, he has a great definition of polyphony, meaning many voices. And so here's a quote from Bakhtin. The essence of polyphony lies precisely in the fact that the voices remain independent and, as such, are combined in a unity of a higher order than a homophony. If one is to talk about individual will, then it is precisely in polyphony that a combination of several individual wills takes place, that the boundaries of individual will can be, in principle, exceeded. One could put it this way: the artistic will of polyphony is a will to combine many wills, a will to the event. So I like this idea of polyphony where there's a respect of voice and individuality, but then there's a coming together towards, hopefully, I am interpreting this in the context of this film, towards a greater purpose. And hopefully in a personal evolution through a group action and connection. So in the adaptation of this film from the short story, the director Hamaguchi takes a real focus on the themes of grief, healing, and connection. And in the adaptation, the director made some really important changes that I believe enhanced the film. And that was towards developing the two central female characters to where they have their own actual story arcs. And the first character is the deceased wife of the main character. The deceased wife, her name, I'll just call her Otto. That's her first name. And the other character, female character, is the actual driver from Drive My Car, the title. And her name is Masaki. And Otto, the wife, and Masaki, the driver, are wonderfully developed into fully realized individuals. And they play so well off of the central male protagonist, Kafuku. And they enhance his character journey as well. So it becomes a very fascinating character study of all three of these individuals. Now, the male character, the protagonist, Kafuku, is a stage actor. And so that is a very important element of this story. So looking at how does the director frame and present this world, that is a very internal character study. And of course, we know film is a visual medium. And so Hamaguchi does this wonderfully. One of his main techniques is to rely on a steady cam on a tripod. And there are multiple scenes where the steady cam is positioned to view Kafuku as he repeats his routines. And the camera just watches him as he goes about his routines. And there's something about the repetition and not moving forward in life, and also the mindlessness of being in a pattern. And so then also, Hamaguchi made another adaptation choice to change the short stories yellow Saab, the car is a Saab, and he changes it to a red Saab. And this really is wonderfully a great choice because Hamaguchi uses this to a great advantage in the film work, where of course, drive my car. There are many scenes of driving, and Hamaguchi uses wide shots of the city streets, the highways, the coastal highways, the inner city road systems. And the red car stands out so well, but at the same time, it's so isolated, and you feel the smallness of this little car among all the cars, or the little car, speeding down the highway as a lone entity. And so it's wonderful. And then, of course, as we see so many times when directors focus on highway systems and road systems, there can be a sense of the complicated and intertwining destinies of individuals and how people's lives intersect. And so once again, I did mention there's a lot of wide shots of the city streets and the cityscapes, and then the countryside views as well, and a lot of aerial views. And so, we really have a sense of the vulnerability and the smallness of the human existence and the human individual. And in the car scenes, the director Hamaguchi usually positions the camera in the back seat. And so Hamaguchi does a wonderful job of truly bringing the film audience into the car. You absolutely feel like you are right there, almost like a child at times, listening, overhearing the conversation between two adults or between two people having a private conversation. You don't feel like an inappropriate voyeur. You feel like privileged in a way to experience this intimacy. And that's what really happens with the idea of the car. It becomes a very intimate space for the characters of Kafuku and Misaki to both connect with each other, connect with another individual. They're both very isolated, grief-stricken characters. And in this realm of the car, they let their guards down and they start the process of thawing their emotions. Now, Kafuku, is caught in a realm of grief because his wife Otto has suddenly died. And in this, we have another theme of the fate and inability to actually control destiny. And so we see several instances of this, these kinds of situations occurring to all different characters. In one of the main plot points pushing the story forward is Kafuku has a car accident, which we find out is due to glaucoma, but it's sudden. And Otto, his wife, dies of a brain hemorrhage. It's absolutely shocking. There's no symptoms, there's no warning. She's just suddenly passed away on the floor in the entryway of the house. Then there's also the death, which is another element of grief, of Kafuku and Otto had a daughter, and she died of influenza when she was 3. So there's that long-standing grief. But also very shocking and a lack of control. And Misaki has her own grief where she was born, again, the idea of fate and destiny. She was born to a mentally ill single mother. And then Misaki's mother, in another cataclysmic event, died in a landslide. And so, we have all of these issues where people's lives are, they're caught up in forces beyond their control. So going back into how does the director Hamaguchi present this world? And so not only is the film so visually impactful, there's also a profound use of an audioscape to convey the sense of isolation and grief. So much of the film is based in silence. There is actually, and there's silence. Then the second most prominent element of the audioscape is the ghostly voice of Otto, the wife. So I mentioned that Kafuku is a stage actor, and before Otto died, she would record the plays and speak the different lines of the different characters, and he would listen in while driving in his car and speak his lines in between her lines. So even after she's passed away, he has the audio recording, and he once again, repeating the pattern. He listens to her voice over and over again, and she forms a very ghostly presence. And this goes back into how this film is very realistic, but it still captures the essence of a magically real sensation with these very profound ghostly hauntings. They're palpable hauntings, and Otto's ghostly voice is very prominent. Then also, we go through, and one of the only diegetic music elements that we have is records playing. And Hamaguchi, the director, will focus a close-up of a record, and we have again the sense of repetition, and all of these characters are trapped in grief, and they've got to do something, connect with someone to jump over this border where they are themselves living as ghosts, as specters and shadows. So once again, going back to this idea of fate, destiny, control, how do we decide to live our lives? We have another theme which goes perfectly with this conference theme of the haiku, which is so often centered on the ephemerality of existence. And the play performance that Kafuku is working on is set, and they're working and performing the play in Hiroshima, which of course is where one of the atomic bombs was dropped. And so the play is haunted, the movie itself is haunted with the peripheral memories of the ecological and psychological devastation of the atomic bomb. And in one scene, Kafuku and Misaki go to a trash center where she used to drive one of the big trash receptacles. Trash cars, and they see it's the whole visual cinematography of the film is muted browns and blues and grays, but when they go to the trash compacting center, they're in this blood red fire scene, and you know the contrast is so jarring to your spirit, and we can't help but think of the cremation and the process of the death of the human body. And there's, you know, the ash and things like that. And once again, the ephemerality and, of course, of the bomb, going back into that horrifying event in human history. And so now we come into, as Misaki and Kafuku connect with each other, Kafuku realizes that Misaki is actually the same age at that time that his daughter would have been if she had lived. And this is very impactful to him. And he sees this young woman so bright and, you know, with such a capacity in her life. And she's an excellent driver as well. And you know, there's an inspiration to reach out and to not let her lose her life to the grief of her mother's physical and psychological abuse, and nor to lose her life to the grief of the loss of her mother and feeling relieved that her mother has passed away as well, which is part of her own trauma, is the relief of the loss of her mother. And so Kafuku reaches outside of himself and encourages Misaki to drive them to the scene of the house where the mother had died in the landslide. And kind of bringing all these images together, she tells the story of how her mother would, after an abusive event, the mother would have a different voice, perhaps indicative of schizophrenia, would come out of her mother and would be a caring individual. And I like to, I thought this was a brilliant insertion to go back into the idea of the polyphony, the voices and the complicated existence of just one single human being, and how many identities were in this very complex abusive mother. And how many identities are in all these different characters and in true living human beings. So Misaki, explains her experiences, and she doesn't have incense with her, but she has a cigarette. And so she takes the cigarette and she plants it in the snow, and she uses it, I think, very appropriately for all of the pain that she experienced through living through her mother's abuse and mental illness. She uses the cigarette as an incense stick to say goodbye and to relieve her grief. So this is a pivotal moment. And after this moment, Kafuku says, he holds her and, as his daughter, and they're just two people, alone in the world, but they've connected. And so it's a wonderful, a beautiful, pivotal moment in the film. And, he tells her that the living, yes, we'll continue to remember the dead, but we are living, we are survivors, and we have to survive, and we have to actually continue to live as truly living beings, not shadows of ourselves. So this represents a great moment where Kafuku himself it's a catharsis for both of them. He is able to then, he has been trapped where he could not really act, and he returns to the stage. And this is another choice where the director decided to elevate and integrate the performance of Anton Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, where the main character is a man very frustrated with life, and so it has a great overlap with Kafuku's sense of frustration with life. And in this, I'm almost done with my discussion, if you'll just bear with me for another about 2 minutes here. And so coming back to the idea of the polyphony, in this, the director, Hamaguchi, creates a wonderful play cast where the play's cast and the film's cast, of course, is a real transnational ensemble of actors. And the performers, they all communicate in either their native language or a chosen language. People are speaking in Japanese, Taiwanese, spoken Korean, and Korean Sign Language. And then also people use English as kind of a hybrid language to bridge any gaps among the different groups. And, then also there's the Korean Sign Language becomes very physical and gestural as well. There's elements of dance coming through. There's elements of sound, where as the actors complete a line in their play practices, they knock on the table. It's very dynamic. It's very meditative, yet very, very dynamic in this film. So then also we come back to this idea of polyphony, where each person is able to retain an independent identity and an independent will, but they collaborate and combine their identities, their forces, and their perspectives to make this play into a performance of a single theme of the ideas of Uncle Vanya, and of course it's the ideas of the movie Drive My Car as well. And so one of my favorite elements of Hamaguchi's directing style is that as people are practicing the play, everything becomes very fluid. And there are times when you think that the play performers are performing for a film audience. But in fact, the camera swings around and it's just a practice. There's no audience. And you, the living audience, you're the only audience for the play performance. Then there's other times where you think that they're only doing a practice and the camera swings around and there's a whole stage of a whole set of film audience. And there was times where I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was alone. But and so it's a wonderful, and there's a great fluidity between the real filmic world and the real living world. And I think that's one of the most impactful elements of this, what I consider a very successful exploration of the human experience. And we have great ideas of intertextuality with the play of Uncle Vanya, then the story of Drive My Car, we have the short story, then then we have the film, and then we have our reactions to all of these elements together. We have the polyphony, where we have the multiple voices, but we have the respect of the individual language and the individual identities. And we have the great idea of the human connection and overcoming grief and combining to a greater sense of ourselves. So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Vivian, that truly was fascinating. And I loved the way you invited Michael Bakhtin and his dialogic imagination to our party. I think it made for very good, insightful, powerful, refreshing perspectives. So with that, it's been absolutely wonderful. We started a bit dodgy, but I think we've come a cropper, and it's just, it's full of surprises, technology, but it's all worked wonders. And I'm wondering if Harish, you would like to make a comment and then open up the floor for questions. I see Anunna wanting to speak as well. So Harish, you go first then.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. I really loved all the papers we've heard today. Can I ask my questions now?
Yes, you can ask a question or maybe a couple, but we'll have to let the others as well as Ananya and whoever else is asking. So make it brief and make it sharp.
I thought I'll ask my 3 questions to the 3 presenters straight up.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm not sure how good these questions are, but here goes. So to Professor Sheng Mei Ma, thank you so much for this very amazing talk, and it was really it resonated with me in a big way. So you argue that any construct of Japanese-ness had been ethnically cleansed in the later Ishiguro. So why do you think this has happened? And is this his diasporic identity coming to the fore in this process? So my second question is to Snigdha, where this idea of guilt that she develops. So where does the guilt come from in the plot, in the narrative? What are the sources of this guilt? I'm just trying to find out whether it's war guilt, or is it within the parameters of the story, or is it tradition versus conservatism? So I'm just thinking of that. And Vivian, what a lovely filmic discussion, where you brought from guilt, we've come to grief. You brought grief to the forefront of the atomic bomb, and we hear in the film that in your argument, grief in polyphonic voices. So if you could also talk about where does this grief come from, and what sort of and why is it so important in that historic time, in that time that the story is set? What makes grief real in history, in historic time, and what makes it real in fictional time? So thank you so very much.
So Professor Ma goes first, and then I think Snigdha, and then Vivian. Go ahead, Professor Ma.
Thank you. Can you still hear me? Great. Yeah, in the part that I skipped altogether is basically the theoretical basis, drawing heavily from Sigmund Freud's idea of primal wound. And this primal wound I attribute to the so-called 1.5 generation, emigrated with his parents at the age of 5, leaving behind his Nagasaki grandparents and house and childhood memories. And this severance, so sudden and so abrupt, sort of led to a lifelong repetition compulsion of revisiting the sense of loss, or in Vivian's phrase, the sense of grief. So the Japanese-ness is there, but it's almost gone. And this Anglophone novelist who can no longer speak Japanese, who doesn't really know the Japanese culture very well anymore. So is writing these white-faced characters, but with a deep, profound repression of almost guilt. And that, of course, is the kind of 1.5 generation between the first generation, immigrant generation like myself, and the second generation like my daughter, born and raised in the West, in the United States to be specific. 1.5 kids who emigrated with the parents at a young age, even teenager. Usually people say between 6 and 13. I mean, that sort of varies. So it becomes sort of a lifelong sense of repetition, compulsion, writing about things that he is familiar with in this Anglophone world, but with a sense of guilt. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ma. I wonder if what he said when I asked him this pointed question in an interview when he visited Toronto at the university, his answer to my question on why he had stopped writing about Japan after A Pale View of Hills and Artist in a Floating World was that he wanted to move into a larger universe. But what you say makes a lot of sense because we do know that Ishiguro's mother was almost didactic in the way that she wanted her children to speak in Japanese. I think you've made an excellent point, and maybe it's a way that he doesn't want to deal with it anymore. This wound that you talk about. What would you say, Professor Ma?
I think 1.5 generation is a very intriguing group of writers. There are so many in the United States. You have Chen Lee, Korean American. You have Chris Lee, also Korean American. You have Suki Kim, also Korean American. You have Jin Chen Ho, Taiwanese American. There's so many. And this group, 1.5 generation, is very intriguing. Shall we say 1.5 generation are different from you, Americans or Asian Americans, and from me, to rephrase F. Scott Fitzgerald's quip on the rich are different from you and me. I would say the 1.5 generation are different from you and me. From you, the Americans of the second generation and beyond, and from me, the first generation. I mean, they have alien residuals, memories of childhood and all that. And they're sort of magical wordsmith, if you think about Chen Lee and the way they use language. But it's very intriguing because this is sort of a magical wordsmith from their early days of ESL classes.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think, Harish, your question was directed to Snigdha. Snigdha, are you still here?
Hi, I am.
Hi, Snigdha. Okay, Harish, a quick recap of your question. Snigdha, do you remember what the question was?
I think Sir asked where the guilt comes from in these works that he discussed. Okay, so in my reading, the guilt these narrators feel comes from looking back at their lives. It emerges out of introspection, but because this introspection takes place in front of an audience, as in it is a performance, they're performing a remembrance, they find ways to cope with it or present it in ways which hides the guilt or tries to, which is why unreliable narration is one of the most discussed things about Ishiguro's narration. In the sense, all of these narrators are looking back at a time which is very different from the time and society they reside in. in the moment of narration. And because values are subject to change across time periods and societies, what we consider good today might change tomorrow. What we consider as our innate responsibility also changes tomorrow. For example, in the case of Ono, when he participated in imperialist propaganda paintings for which he is disgraced today, he didn't think it would be considered as warmongering by the next generation. He even mentions in the book how when your country goes to war, you do whatever you think you can to help. So I think when the tides turn on these narrators, they're forced to take some accountability for their actions, even if they cannot really relate to what really changed, why the perception of the society is suddenly different towards them. They take accountability, and uh, it is in a way like this. It's through this kind of an introspection that the guilt emerges in the novels, according to me.
Excellent answer, on point. Thank you so much, Snigdha. Vivian, would you like to address Harish's question before we move on to Ananya?
Yes, oh, great. Thank you so much. And so, going back with Snigdha's comments on introspection, I think that connects very nicely to this film and my interpretation. And so, and not to be just overly optimistic about things, but I think that in this movie, Drive My Car, there's a real emotional sense of, these characters had to somehow burst out of this shadow realm of grief where they were just living a bare kind of minimum existence of patterns and going through the motions of life. And so by connecting with each other, they were able to overcome that grief. And, if we think about, I didn't actually mention this, the final scene of the film is so uplifting because we see the young driver Misaki, and you don't know where she is, but you realize through deducing that she's actually moved to Korea, and she's just doing the simple basic action of shopping in a grocery store. And she comes out and she speaks Korean in the grocery store. She's very acclimatized and she seems comfortable and very happy. She's so much lighter. The actress does a wonderful job in this scene. And she comes out and you see she has been gifted the red Saab car by Kafuku. And so you feel their connection has become this father-daughter connection where he's gifted her this car. And she also has a golden retriever. So she has her own companion. And so I think in this film, the grief really is something that needs to be looked at and explored, not denied, but overcome so that people can live full lives and also beyond the survivor level, and to protect and encourage the joy and happiness in future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you. Ananya, go for it. Ask your question.
So I apologize for not turning on my video. I'm currently in the process of houses, and there's just boxes and clutter all around me, and also a lot of cats. So I'm just going to keep my video off for now. Also, I'm sorry for what I'm about to say next, because I know it's a dreaded sentence in academic conferences, but I don't have a question, and it's more of a comment. I just wanted to thank Vivian for her paper, basically. I haven't yet watched the film, and I cannot wait to watch it now. Thank you for the amazing recommendation, because I'm just hyped to watch it. I could just visualize the entire thing the way you've presented the paper. So yes, thank you for that. But most importantly, what it has done, it has made me introspect on the idea of grief and the many voices that you said characterize a human being when you were talking about the abusive mother and her the moments of kindness that she would show after she would abuse her daughter. And so basically my paper tomorrow relates to grief and silences, so it has given me a new perspective, and I'm going to revisit my paper tonight and hopefully add a few notes myself. So yes, thank you. I adored your paper, and I cannot wait for it to be published so I can revisit it properly.
So there you go, Vivian. All that we dream about in an academic conference is coming to bear. Wonderful. Looking forward to more questions.
Is there a question from my friend Vinod? Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Vivian.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, about this character of Kafuku. I wonder whether all this guilt gets built up because of the way he handles the events in the first part of the film. I mean, he seems to be so very devoid of expressions. They're very intense moments. Like for him to discover, that his wife is with somebody else in bed, and he just walks back. I mean, there's nothing in his body language, or, he doesn't even say anything, of course. Also, when he discovers his wife's body there, we don't know because the director cuts and then goes to the place, the temple where they're praying. So we don't know whether there was. So I wonder if all this guilt gets built up, because I don't know whether it's peculiar to Japanese society that you don't really give vent to your feelings, which is very different from, I don't know, I saw a Kurosawa movie where there's a death happening in a village, and you have the whole village celebrating, very joyous and shouting, and so I don't know how it fits in here. This is one thing, and the other thing I was wondering is the part where the scenes in the car are shown. The cameras at the back, and that, yes, it takes us inside the car, but yet those distances are maintained. We don't really get to see them. There was another very beautiful Malayalam movie I watched where you had just two characters for the entire movie, and what they did was they placed the camera on the dashboard. It's not visible, but so you were really inside the car. You could see every expression of. There were only two people, one driving and there's another girl there. So you can you get in there. There must be some reason. I think he didn't want us to really experience them so intimately. So I don't know what the reason is. What is your take on these two things? I was curious.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Pillai. That's very interesting. I'll address both of these points. I agree with you about Kafuku as a very repressed man. He talks about how he was very aware that his wife was having affairs consistently with her actors when she would be working on a screenplay. And it seemed maybe to be part of her process and a part of their marital kind of undiscussed parameters. And so I think that from my point of view, it seemed like he had a frustration that he didn't connect with her and say, I'm not comfortable with you having these affairs. I think that was part of his self-frustration, that he didn't kind of stand up for his love for her. And I think that also complicated his grief process because, of course, there was an anger and a self-anger about this issue. So I appreciate, your point of view on that. And I love your point about the car because I felt so intimate with the camera in the back seat because so many times in car scenes, the camera will be kind of positioned at the window, right? And you'll do the reverse shot of the two characters. And in fact, when we have Kafuku talking with the lover, the young man, that's how that extended scene is just reverse shot of the two men sitting in the back seat. So I appreciate your point. I might kind of steal that idea and integrate it because maybe it goes back into the idea of the audioscape and we're listening to the voices. I feel like the voices of Kafuku and Masaki are so pained. They're so internalized and retracted. And so perhaps not seeing their faces leaves us to listen to the repressed emotion. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent, Vinod. You gave us so much meat on the bone that even Vivian enjoyed your insight there. Thanks so much. So Harish, should we call it a day if there are no more questions?
Yes, absolutely. We can call it a day. I'd just like to thank our keynote speaker, Professor Sheng Mema, once again, and going down the line to thank Associate Professor Chitra, who couldn't come because she's got a viral fever attack, whose paper I'd read. And then to thank Snigdha Mishra of University of Hyderabad for her remarks and her handling of the question. And of course, Vivian Taylor for her very vigorous and very effervescent exposition. So thank you very much, all of you, and the audience, and the questions that, Vinod asked, and we had a nice comment from Ananya. So we look forward to tomorrow now. Tomorrow is another day. So we shall, I hope, not have me perform another of my snafus.
And I want to quickly just say a huge thank you to Mohini and to Harsh, who've managed the tech part so well. I kept coming and going and coming and going. I don't know what happened to my net. And thank you, Rohini, for being here, and all of you. So we'll see you tomorrow. Good morning and good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.